Music. When historians describe the year 1896 at Niagara Falls, they usually focus on the triumph above ground, the opening of the world's first large-scale hydroelectric power station, the genius of Nikola Tesla's alternating current system, and the 100,000 horsepower that would soon power Buffalo and beyond. But the real story, the one that barely appeared in engineering journals, the one that even today sits buried in archival footnotes, began below the surface. It started with a simple excavation order. Engineers were instructed to dig beneath the falls, carve out chambers for turbines, and determine whether the bedrock could support the massive infrastructure needed to harness the river's power. The goal was practical: prepare the foundation, install the generators, and launch the electrical age. But the moment workers began drilling through the ancient rock, something unexpected happened. They broke through layers that hadn't been exposed in centuries. Beneath the riverbed, deeper than geological surveys had predicted, the crews found chambers and conduits that didn't match any construction plans. Their design was unusual. Their purpose was unclear, and the infrastructure didn't resemble anything in the engineering manuals of the era. It didn't even resemble European power systems as commonly understood. This wasn't mentioned in public reports about the power station. It didn't make it into the newspapers celebrating America's electrical future. But in the internal notes of that year, a quiet phrase appears over and over again: pre-existing infrastructure, unexpected depth, origin unknown. The official story would later simplify all of this into abandoned mill tunnels, natural limestone caves, or simply misidentified geological features. Nothing unusual, nothing worth discussion. But the construction photographs from the time, the ones developed in dim sight offices while Niagara prepared to electrify the world, show something different. They show workers standing beside tunnel walls cut with precision, far cleaner than any drill of the era should allow. Passages lined with channels so uniform that even in the poor lighting of 1896 photography, the engineering is undeniable. Distribution systems and cable housings that don't resemble any known electrical infrastructure, but something older, more complex, more deliberate. And the deeper they dug, the more the layers stopped looking like natural geology and more like technology that had been installed, operated, and deliberately buried. At first, the construction crews tried to categorize everything in the simplest way possible: old mining tunnels, natural erosion channels, debris from earlier attempts to harness the falls. But as documentation accumulated and more chambers were uncovered, the inconsistencies multiplied. Why were some of the underground structures built with load-bearing capacity far exceeding anything planned for the power station? Why were certain conduits shaped in modular sections as if mass-manufactured rather than hand-carved? Why did some passages extend into darkness far beyond the footprint of any documented construction? And the question that troubled even the most experienced engineers: why were these systems so sophisticated? Niagara Falls in 1896 was pioneering electrical distribution, yet the infrastructure beneath parts of the excavation zone appeared built for purposes no contemporary engineer could identify. Construction teams quietly admitted among themselves that the design and precision didn't line up with any known project. And although none of them were using terms like lost technology, they were acknowledging something just as unsettling. Someone had built a power system here before, not simple waterworks, not primitive mills, something else entirely. As the documentation increased, so did the silence. Reports became shorter, descriptions became vague. Photographs stopped showing the widest views of the discoveries, and then the excavation zones were partially filled again in late 1896, covered where needed for the new turbine installations, and much of what was exposed was returned to darkness. Only fragments remain: notes, a handful of photographs, and the quiet testimonies of engineers who saw the chambers before some of them were sealed forever. But even from what survives, a pattern becomes visible. Infrastructure, too, advanced for any documented American project. Engineering too precise for the accepted timeline. Construction methods that look inherited rather than invented. Technology that seems to belong to a different era of building entirely. When the construction teams moved past the first recognizable geology beneath Niagara, the expectations were simple. They believed they would find solid bedrock, perhaps some natural caves formed by water erosion and scattered remnants from early industrial attempts. Nothing unusual, nothing extraordinary. But within weeks, that assumption collapsed, because instead of untouched rock, the teams uncovered layer upon layer of pre-existing construction that didn't behave the way abandoned infrastructure is supposed to behave. The first anomaly was integration. Each layer, known construction, unknown sublevels, and whatever lay beneath, seemed to follow the same power distribution logic, the same conduit patterns, the same engineering framework. Different eras shouldn't do that. Different builders, different purposes, different decades. They don't build in perfect integration with systems that came centuries apart. Yet beneath Niagara, they did. Cable channels from one era connected directly to chambers buried meters below them. Distribution hubs shared the same geometric layout, even when separated by what appeared to be generations. It was as if every group that ever built on this ground was tapping into an original power grid, one that no longer existed in any historical record. If you're finding this investigation compelling, consider subscribing. These mysteries don't fit neatly into official history, and uncovering them requires looking where conventional narratives refuse to go. As the workers dug deeper, the layers became stranger. Beneath the expected limestone and bedrock, they began encountering infrastructure that looked nothing like 19th century engineering. Much larger conduits, much tighter tolerances, patterns that seemed too mathematically precise for anything in America's documented timeline. Some chambers appeared almost over-engineered, vaulted spaces with perfect acoustics, crafted with precision that didn't match the industrial capabilities of the time. And then came the discovery that puzzled even the most conservative members of the engineering teams. High-temperature ceramics, tunnel surfaces lined with materials designed to withstand extreme heat, lower chambers with thermal shielding, walls with insulation properties that only make sense for systems generating enormous power. Yet, there is no historical record of Niagara ever having such power generation before 1896. No documents showing industrial processes requiring this kind of thermal management. Nothing that explains why large sections of the deepest infrastructure looked like they had once housed technology far beyond water wheels and mechanical mills. Construction photographs taken in 1896 show this clearly. Workers standing beside conduits so massive that the men look miniature in comparison. Components machined so precisely that even today, electrical engineers study the archival images in disbelief. Tolerances and fits that resemble modern power infrastructure far more than anything 19th century America is credited with. But the most unsettling detail was not what appeared in the photographs. It was what didn't appear in the archives. The official reports written in the months after the power station opened barely mention these features. Some drawings omit the deepest chambers entirely. Certain infrastructure is summarized with vague terms like earlier construction or geological formations, even though the photographs show it was far more complex than that. The silence is hard to miss, because if these deeper discoveries truly belong to known historical periods, why weren't they described in detail? Why weren't the unusual systems documented thoroughly? Why were the photographs scattered across private engineering collections instead of gathered into a single project archive? What the construction crews uncovered were structures that didn't match early American engineering, didn't match European power systems, and didn't even match each other in any conventional sense. Instead, they formed a strange technological language, one that seemed to come from multiple eras, yet somehow remained unified, integrated, and impossibly precise. The first shock came with the chambers themselves. These weren't crude excavations or narrow utility tunnels. They were geometrically perfect spaces, rooms shaped with exact dimensions, vaulted ceilings that held their curve flawlessly, and cable housings laid out with coherence, almost like the remnants of a master power station that no longer exists in any archive. Some chambers were sealed completely, packed with fill so dense that workers thought they had hit solid rock. But once opened, they revealed interiors that looked untouched since the day they were closed. Smooth walls, precision-cut channels, and infrastructure that raised more questions than answers. And then came the feature that still puzzles researchers today: the giant cylindrical housing units. Officially, they were later labeled as old turbine casings or abandoned mill equipment. But nothing about them fits typical water heat construction or early industrial machinery. These were too symmetrical, too precisely machined, and too perfectly sealed, as if they were designed with tools capable of maintaining tolerances we associate with modern manufacturing. Some housings were large enough for several men to stand inside. Others contained internal mechanisms that appeared designed for rotation at tremendous speeds. Workers from 1896 described them in private letters as engineered vessels, not storage tanks, but containers with a power generation purpose, though no one could say what that purpose might have been. Another anomaly appeared in the cable routing systems. These were not simply conduits resting on tunnel floors. Many were integrated into the rock walls themselves, positioned at angles that made no engineering sense, embedded in stone that clearly predated any electrical system America officially possessed. It created an uncomfortable possibility. The power station above ground may not simply rest on convenient geology. It may sit on something much larger, an electrical infrastructure whose capacity was never recorded, never taught, and never explained in the official history of Niagara Falls. The deeper the workers dug, the stranger the findings became. Conduit sections appeared with perfectly uniform dimensions. Some surfaces were polished smooth, almost frictionless. Others showed precision-cut grooves so clean that modern electrical engineers still argue about what tools could have produced them. But the discovery that caused the most confusion was the crystalline formations inside certain conduits. Some appeared fused to the metal surfaces. Others showed electromagnetic properties that material scientists of 1896 couldn't explain. The official explanation offered later: mineral deposits, natural crystallization. But that does not explain why these formations appear in organized patterns, not random growth, but structured, engineered, designed to conduct or regulate electrical current. That kind of material science requires knowledge far beyond the 19th century capability, far beyond anything recorded in American technological history. Soon after these discoveries, something unusual began happening. Chambers were filled again. Passages were blocked. Deep sections of the excavation zone were cut off from further exploration. Some of this was officially labeled as safety concerns necessary to support the turbine installations above. But the decisions about which chambers to seal first and which areas to bury permanently raise quiet questions among observers. Because the spaces that were closed immediately were always the ones that contained the most anomalous technology. The precision housings, the unknown crystalline formations, the integrated cable systems, the engineered chambers that seemed to extend far beyond the construction zone. These passages were perhaps the most mysterious find of all. They weren't random tunnels. They were part of an organized pattern, a grid of conduits that looked less like geology and more like infrastructure. Aligned, measured, planned, as if they once served a continental power distribution system, one that stretched beneath North America long before Tesla's alternating current was ever designed. And yet, almost as soon as they were uncovered, many were sealed again. Their entrances blocked, their purpose unexplored, their existence quietly removed from subsequent engineering reports. When you study the final weeks of the 1896 construction, something becomes impossible to ignore. The excavation didn't end. It was stopped, not completed, not concluded, stopped. The deeper the construction teams went, the more the tone of their notes changed. Early entries were confident, almost routine. But by the end, the language becomes cautious, vague, and strangely incomplete, as if someone else suddenly controlled what could be documented. And this is where the final mystery begins, because the last chambers they opened beneath Niagara Falls weren't ordinary. They weren't geological. They weren't abandoned millworks. They weren't even identifiable as any known type of infrastructure. They were something else entirely. Multiple reports, the few that survived, described technology that suddenly shifted from the familiar to the unexplainable. Housings with tolerances so tight you couldn't fit paper between components. Cable systems balanced with precision that 19th century America was never supposed to have. Distribution hubs built to handle loads far greater than anything the new power station would generate. And tunnels that extended beyond the excavation zone, disappearing into darkness beneath modern New York State. But here's the part that always gets buried. The most advanced chambers were the ones that were sealed the fastest. Workers described filling entire rooms back in, blocking entrances, packing rubble into spaces that had just been uncovered. It wasn't gradual, it was immediate. The official explanation: structural concerns, construction deadlines, safety requirements. But if it was only about safety, why were the most sophisticated, most precisely engineered chambers the ones sealed first? And why were the obviously unstable geological sections left exposed for the turbine installations? It doesn't make sense unless those deeper discoveries posed a different kind of threat. Not a physical one, a historical one. Because if the infrastructure beneath Niagara Falls truly showed engineering far beyond 19th century capability, and if some of that technology didn't match any known electrical system at all, then the entire accepted story of America's electrical age begins to collapse. Imagine what it would mean if the world's first major power grid was built on top of something far older, something sophisticated, something engineered, something we didn't build. Imagine what it means if the foundations weren't just convenient bedrock, but deliberate attempts by later engineers to tap into or repurpose a power system they couldn't explain. And maybe that is why the 1896 discoveries were quietly re-earied, not to protect the site, but to protect the narrative. The surviving photographs tell their own story. Workers standing next to conduits that look almost modern, components that resemble precision manufacturing systems too integrated for their supposed age. These aren't the kinds of discoveries historians like to explain. They're the kinds they prefer not to talk about at all. And that brings us to the final question. A question no archive, no textbook, no official publication has ever answered fully. Why was the deepest evidence, the most sophisticated technology, the most anomalous infrastructure sealed away again? Because when you step back, the pattern becomes clear. The precision conduits were buried, the crystalline formations were buried, the integrated power systems were buried, the engineered distribution hubs were buried, and even parts of the photographic record vanished. Almost as if the construction had accidentally revealed a chapter of history that wasn't supposed to surface. A chapter older than the electrical age, older than industrial America, older than the narrative we were given. And for one brief moment, in 1896, the Earth opened just enough to show it. But instead of studying it, they closed it again, sealed it, filled it, forgot it, or pretended to. Because if Niagara Falls Power Station stands on top of technology built by a civilization we no longer acknowledge, then the real question is not what was discovered in 1896. It's what else lies beneath the infrastructure of the world. What other power stations, what other dams, what other convenient developments gave engineers just enough time to bury what they found below? The 1896 buried power vaults weren't just abandoned equipment from an earlier era. They were a glimpse, a brief, accidental glimpse into a version of history we were never meant to see. And now that glimpse is your clue, your map, your invitation to question everything we think we know about how our electrical grid was really built. Because if this is what survived under one power station, imagine what still hums in the darkness beneath the rest. Something out of place, something out of time. Thanks for watching. And if you found this interesting, well, there are a lot more cities with stories like this. Maybe I'll see you in the next one.